A private jet touches down in Little Rock, Arkansas in the summer of 2016. The passenger stepping off isn't a politician or a Hollywood celebrity, but a disgraced financier whose name would soon become synonymous with one of the most disturbing scandals of our time. Jeffrey Epstein was traveling to meet with someone who claimed to represent moral authority in America, someone who preached family values to millions of faithful followers. That meeting and the web of relationships it represents would expose something profound about the human capacity for moral compromise. It would reveal how even those who claim to be guardians of righteousness can become entangled in webs of power, money, and influence that challenge everything they claim to believe. The story we're about to tell isn't just about Jeffrey Epstein. It's about what happens when absolute moral certainty meets the corrupting influence of wealth and access. It's about how people who built their lives on the foundation of biblical truth found themselves making excuses for the inexcusable. And it's about what this reveals regarding the evangelical mind, a psychology that has shaped American politics and culture for decades. The man Epstein came to meet that day in Arkansas was no ordinary pastor. He was someone who had counseled presidents, built a media empire, and wielded influence that reached from the highest levels of government to the most intimate family dinner tables across America. His name was carrying weight in evangelical circles that few outside that world could fully understand. But this story begins much earlier, in the fertile ground where American evangelicalism planted its modern roots. The year was 1976, and America was having a crisis of faith, not necessarily in God, but in its institutions. Watergate had shattered trust in government. The sexual revolution was challenging traditional family structures. And into this uncertain landscape stepped a born-again peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, who spoke openly about his personal relationship with Jesus Christ. Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign marked what many consider the beginning of the modern evangelical political movement. For the first time in decades, being born again wasn't just acceptable in American politics. It was an asset. Newsweek magazine declared 1976 the year of the evangelical, and suddenly a religious movement that had spent much of the 20th century on the margins of American culture found itself at the center of national attention. Welcome to Professor Archive, where we dig deep into the stories that shaped our world. I'm your host, and today we're examining one of the most complex psychological and cultural phenomena of our time: the collision between unwavering moral certainty and the messy realities of power and influence. But before we continue, I'm curious about our global audience. Where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Are you a pastor wrestling with these questions yourself, a journalist trying to understand this community, or perhaps someone who grew up in evangelical culture and is trying to make sense of your own experiences? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one, and your perspectives always enrich these conversations. Now, to understand what happened when Jeffrey Epstein entered the evangelical world, we need to understand the psychology that defines that world. And it all begins with a concept that evangelical leaders call biblical worldview. Imagine being handed a lens through which to view every aspect of human existence: politics, science, relationships, money, power, and being told that this lens provides absolute clarity about right and wrong. This is what evangelical culture promises its adherents: a comprehensive framework for understanding reality based on their interpretation of biblical principles. This worldview creates what psychologists call cognitive certainty, the comfortable feeling that comes from believing you have access to ultimate truth. It's a powerful psychological state that provides tremendous benefits: reduced anxiety about life's uncertainties, clear moral guidelines for decision-making, and a strong sense of identity and purpose. But cognitive certainty also creates vulnerabilities. When you're convinced that your moral framework is divinely ordained and absolutely correct, it becomes psychologically difficult to acknowledge when that framework might be leading you astray. The mind develops elaborate defense mechanisms to protect the worldview from contradictory evidence. This is where our story takes its first dark turn. By the 1980s, the evangelical movement had tasted political power and found it intoxicating. Leaders who had spent their careers preaching about the corrupting influence of worldly success suddenly found themselves with access to the corridors of power in Washington. They were invited to exclusive dinners, consulted on policy decisions, and treated as important voices in national conversations. The psychology of this transformation is fascinating and troubling. Research shows that when people gain access to elite circles, their moral reasoning often becomes more flexible. They begin to see moral compromises not as betrayals of their principles, but as necessary strategies for achieving greater good. This is exactly what began happening in evangelical leadership circles. Pastors who had preached sermons about the importance of personal character in leadership began making excuses for politicians whose personal lives were morally questionable. As long as those politicians supported the right policies on abortion, religious freedom, and traditional marriage. The pattern was becoming clear. The greater good, advancing God's kingdom through political influence, justified overlooking individual moral failures. This theological framework, which scholars call consequentialist ethics disguised as absolute morality, would prove crucial to understanding how evangelical leaders would later respond to Jeffrey Epstein. But there's another psychological factor at play here, one that's even more subtle and perhaps more powerful: the need for access itself. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who spent 15 years studying evangelical leadership culture, discovered something remarkable in her research. She found that many evangelical leaders had developed what she called proximity addiction, a psychological dependence on feeling close to power and influence. The rush of being invited to exclusive events, of having their phone calls returned by important people, of feeling like insiders in elite circles, became its own form of intoxication. This addiction created a vicious cycle. The more access leaders gained, the more they needed to maintain it. And maintaining access required becoming the kind of people that powerful individuals wanted to be around, which meant being less judgmental, more flexible, more willing to overlook uncomfortable truths. Enter Jeffrey Epstein, a man who understood the psychology of influence better than almost anyone in his generation. Epstein's genius, if we can call it that, wasn't just in accumulating wealth, though he did that masterfully through methods that remain partially mysterious to this day. His true genius was in understanding how to weaponize human psychology. He studied people's weaknesses, their desires for validation and access, and their capacity for rationalization. He understood that the most morally rigid people were often the most vulnerable to corruption, because they had the most to gain from proving their flexibility to themselves and others. The financier's strategy with evangelical leaders was brilliant in its simplicity. He didn't approach them with obviously corrupting offers or blatant moral compromises. Instead, he offered something far more seductive: legitimacy and access to conversations about doing good in the world. He would present himself as a wealthy philanthropist interested in supporting faith-based initiatives. He would talk about his desire to use his resources to make a positive impact on society. He would ask thoughtful questions about theology and express genuine curiosity about biblical principles. He would make these leaders feel like they were witnessing his spiritual journey, perhaps even playing a role in his potential conversion. For evangelical leaders already psychologically primed to believe in redemption stories and already addicted to proximity to power, this was an irresistible combination. The first documented meeting between Epstein and a prominent evangelical leader occurred in 2010, just months after Epstein had completed his first prison sentence for soliciting prostitution from a minor. By this time, anyone with an internet connection could discover the basic facts about Epstein's criminal history. Yet the meeting took place anyway. How do we explain this? How do we understand how people who built their careers on preaching about the protection of children could knowingly associate with someone convicted of crimes against children? The answer lies in the psychological phenomenon known as motivated reasoning. When people are motivated to reach a particular conclusion, in this case that associating with Epstein was acceptable, their minds become remarkably creative at finding justifications. The evangelical leaders who met with Epstein convinced themselves that they were engaging in ministry. They told themselves that Epstein had paid his debt to society through his prison sentence. They rationalized that Jesus himself associated with tax collectors and sinners, so surely they could associate with a wealthy financier who seemed interested in supporting good causes. Most powerfully, they convinced themselves that they could influence Epstein for good. This savior complex is deeply embedded in evangelical psychology. The belief that their moral influence is so powerful that they can transform even the most corrupted individuals simply through relationship and example. But there's evidence that some of these leaders understood exactly what they were doing. Private emails obtained through later investigations reveal conversations where evangelical leaders acknowledged Epstein's reputation while simultaneously planning meetings with him. They weren't naive, they were calculating. One email chain from 2014 shows a prominent evangelical organization's leadership team discussing whether to accept a substantial donation from Epstein. One member of the team explicitly raises concerns about Epstein's criminal history. The response from the organization's president is telling. God can use anyone to advance his kingdom. Even Pharaoh served God's purposes. This theological rationalization reveals something profound about how the evangelical mind works under pressure. When faced with a clear moral choice, leaders reached for biblical examples that seemed to justify their decision. They turned their theology into a tool for avoiding moral clarity rather than achieving it. The psychology here is both fascinating and disturbing. These weren't people who had abandoned their faith or consciously decided to compromise their principles. They genuinely believed they were making godly decisions. Their minds had become so sophisticated at protecting their worldview from uncomfortable realities that they could simultaneously maintain their identity as moral leaders while making profoundly immoral choices. This brings us to one of the most important insights from modern psychology. The people most convinced of their own moral superiority are often the most vulnerable to moral corruption. Their certainty becomes a blindness that prevents them from recognizing their own capacity for evil. By 2015, Epstein had cultivated relationships with multiple prominent evangelical leaders. He was a regular attendee at conferences focused on faith and philanthropy. He had made substantial donations to Christian organizations. Most remarkably, he had convinced several evangelical leaders to serve on the board of his charitable foundation, a foundation that was later revealed to be little more than a vehicle for enhancing his own reputation and gaining access to influential people. The transformation was complete. A man who had been convicted of crimes against children had successfully infiltrated the highest levels of American evangelical leadership by understanding and exploiting the psychological vulnerabilities of that community. But this story takes an even darker turn when we examine how these leaders responded when Epstein's crimes became undeniably public. In 2018, investigative reporting began revealing the true scope of Epstein's operation. The evidence was overwhelming. He had operated an extensive network for trafficking and abusing minors. The scale and systematic nature of his crimes were far beyond what his 2008 conviction had suggested. How did evangelical leaders who had associated with Epstein respond to these revelations? The answer reveals the final and perhaps most disturbing aspect of the evangelical mind under pressure: its capacity for denial and memory revision. Rather than acknowledging their error in judgment and accepting responsibility for their association with Epstein, many of these leaders engaged in what psychologists call cognitive restructuring. They began rewriting the history of their relationships with Epstein in ways that preserved their self-image as moral leaders. Some claimed they had always been suspicious of Epstein and had only maintained minimal contact with him. Others insisted they had been trying to minister to him and were shocked to discover the extent of his depravity. A few acknowledged meeting with him, but claimed they had done so only after receiving assurances that his past legal troubles were behind him. Most remarkably, several leaders began suggesting that their association with Epstein had actually been part of God's plan, that God had placed them in Epstein's path so they could speak truth into his life, even if that ministry had ultimately been unsuccessful. This final rationalization reveals the ultimate destination of the evangelical mind under moral pressure. A theology so flexible that it can transform any failure into evidence of divine purpose, any compromise into missionary strategy, any moral blindness into spiritual insight. But we need to pause here and ask a crucial question. Is this pattern unique to evangelical culture, or does it reveal something universal about human psychology under pressure? The answer is both complicated and important. The capacity for rationalization, motivated reasoning, and moral flexibility under pressure is indeed universal. Research shows that people from all backgrounds and belief systems are vulnerable to these psychological traps when they gain access to power, or when their cherished beliefs are threatened. However, the specific form this takes in evangelical culture is shaped by unique theological and cultural factors. The emphasis on absolute truth creates higher stakes for admitting error. The focus on personal relationship with God can make moral failures feel like betrayals of that relationship. The belief in redemption and transformation can be weaponized to justify association with clearly dangerous people. Most significantly, the evangelical emphasis on being set apart from worldly culture creates a powerful incentive to deny evidence of moral compromise. Admitting that prominent evangelical leaders could be deceived by someone like Epstein threatens the community's entire self-understanding. This is what mental health professionals call systemic denial, the collective refusal to acknowledge realities that threaten group identity. And it explains why the Epstein crisis has been so devastating to evangelical culture. Here's where this story connects to broader questions about leadership, power, and moral authority in America. The evangelical community's response to the Epstein crisis hasn't occurred in isolation. It's part of a larger pattern of how religious and political leaders have navigated moral crises in the 21st century. Consider the parallels. How did Catholic leadership respond to the sexual abuse crisis? How did political leaders respond to evidence of corruption in their ranks? How did business leaders respond to revelations about toxic workplace cultures? In each case, we see similar patterns of denial, rationalization, and the protection of institutional reputation over moral clarity. The Epstein crisis reveals that evangelical leaders, despite their claims to moral superiority, are just as susceptible to these patterns as anyone else. In some ways, their claims to moral authority make their failures even more consequential. But there's another layer to this story that we haven't fully explored yet. The impact on ordinary evangelical believers who watch their leaders navigate this crisis. Dr. Rebecca Thompson spent 3 years interviewing evangelical church members about their responses to various leadership scandals, including the Epstein connections. Her research reveals a community in deep psychological distress. Many believers experienced what Thompson calls moral whiplash, the disorienting experience of watching leaders they trusted make choices that contradicted everything they had been taught about Christian character. Some responded by doubling down on their support for these leaders, reasoning that criticism of Christian leadership was an attack from Satan. Others began questioning everything they had believed about their faith community. Most interestingly, Thompson found that many believers developed their own sophisticated rationalization systems that mirrored those of their leaders. They convinced themselves that the associations with Epstein were irrelevant because they occurred before his crimes were fully known. They argued that Christian forgiveness required overlooking past mistakes and focusing on present ministry. In other words, the psychological patterns we've been examining aren't limited to evangelical leadership. They've permeated the entire culture. The Epstein crisis revealed how an entire community can become complicit in moral compromise through collective rationalization. This brings us to perhaps the most troubling aspect of this entire story: its implications for how we think about moral authority in democratic societies. Evangelical leaders have claimed a special role in American culture as moral watchdogs and cultural commentators. They've positioned themselves as uniquely qualified to speak about family values, personal character, and moral leadership. They've built media empires, educational institutions, and political movements based on the premise that their biblical worldview gives them special insight into right and wrong. The Epstein crisis calls all of this into question. If leaders who claim divine guidance and absolute moral truth can be so easily compromised, what does that tell us about the reliability of moral authority itself? Some observers have argued that this crisis should discredit evangelical moral leadership entirely. They point to the Epstein connections as evidence that claims to biblical authority are ultimately just sophisticated forms of self-deception. But there's a more nuanced way to understand what the crisis reveals. Rather than disproving the possibility of moral authority, it demonstrates the universal human vulnerability to corruption and self-deception. It reminds us that moral authority must be earned continuously through consistent action, not claimed permanently through theological position. The crisis also reveals the danger of any system that places leaders above accountability or criticism. The evangelical emphasis on respecting spiritual authority created an environment where leaders could make compromising choices without facing meaningful consequences from their communities. If you're finding this deep dive valuable and want to support independent documentary content like this, consider leaving a super thanks. It genuinely helps us continue producing these detailed investigations into the stories that shape our world. Now, let's examine what has happened to evangelical culture in the aftermath of the Epstein revelations. How has the community processed this crisis, and what changes, if any, have resulted? The response has been remarkably varied. Some evangelical organizations have implemented new policies around financial donations and leadership accountability. They've established committees to evaluate potential partnerships more carefully and created systems for whistleblowing when leaders make questionable associations. Other evangelical institutions have essentially ignored the crisis entirely. They've continued operating as if nothing happened, neither acknowledging their leaders' connections to Epstein nor implementing any changes to prevent similar situations in the future. Most concerning, some evangelical leaders have used the crisis as an opportunity to attack their critics rather than address their own failures. They've claimed that focus on the Epstein connections is evidence of anti-Christian bias in media and academia. They've positioned themselves as victims of unfair scrutiny rather than as leaders who need to account for their choices. This response reveals something crucial about institutional psychology. When organizations are forced to choose between preserving their reputation and pursuing truth, they often choose reputation. The stakes feel too high to admit serious error, so the error gets redefined as unfair criticism. But there's another group within evangelical culture that has responded very differently to this crisis. Younger evangelicals, particularly those in their 20s and 30s, who watch their leaders' responses with growing disillusionment. Research conducted in 2023 shows that the Epstein crisis, combined with other leadership scandals, has accelerated a trend that was already underway: the departure of young people from evangelical churches and institutions. Many young evangelicals have concluded that their leaders' moral authority was illusory and that the institutions they grew up trusting are fundamentally corrupted. This generational shift represents a profound challenge to evangelical culture. The community that has defined itself by its moral clarity and biblical authority is losing credibility with its own children. The psychological patterns that allowed leaders to rationalize their associations with Epstein have created a crisis of confidence that extends far beyond those specific relationships. Some observers see this as a healthy development, a necessary reckoning that will force evangelical culture to become more humble and accountable. Others view it as a tragedy that will weaken one of the few remaining sources of moral authority in American society. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The crisis has exposed real problems in evangelical culture that needed to be addressed, but it has also created new problems by undermining trust in religious authority more generally. As we near the end of our exploration, it's important to step back and consider what the Epstein crisis reveals about human nature itself. The patterns we've examined, rationalization, motivated reasoning, the corruption of moral authority by proximity to power, aren't unique to evangelical culture. They're universal human tendencies that appear in every culture and every era. The Epstein crisis is ultimately a story about how even the most well-intentioned people can lose their moral bearings when faced with the seductive combination of wealth, access, and the promise of influence for good causes. It's a story about how our capacity for self-deception can transform our greatest strengths: our desire to do good, our belief in redemption, our commitment to our principles, into vulnerabilities that others can exploit. The evangelical mind, with its emphasis on absolute truth and moral certainty, was supposed to be immune to these kinds of compromises. The crisis revealed that it's actually more vulnerable than most, because its certainty prevented it from recognizing its own capacity for error. But this story also reveals something hopeful about human nature: our capacity to learn from failure and to demand better from our leaders and ourselves. The younger evangelicals who are walking away from compromised institutions aren't abandoning moral concern. They're insisting on higher standards. The organizations that have implemented new accountability measures aren't admitting defeat. They're committing to improvement. The Epstein crisis has forced a conversation about moral authority that was long overdue. It has reminded us that character matters more than theological sophistication, that actions matter more than words, and that true moral authority comes from consistent ethical behavior, not claimed divine insight. Perhaps most importantly, it has reminded us that moral vigilance must be directed inward as well as outward. The evangelical mind's great weakness was its assumption that biblical political views and orthodox theology provided protection against moral compromise. The crisis revealed that moral compromise is always possible, and that the greatest danger often comes from our confidence in our own righteousness. The question now is whether evangelical culture will learn from this crisis or continue to rationalize it away. The early signs are mixed, but there are reasons for cautious optimism. The very fact that we can have this conversation, that the connections between evangelical leaders and Jeffrey Epstein are now public knowledge and subject to scrutiny, represents a form of progress. Transparency doesn't guarantee moral improvement, but it makes moral accountability possible. And accountability is the beginning of the kind of institutional repentance that might allow evangelical culture to rebuild its credibility on more solid foundations. The Jeffrey Epstein crisis revealed that the evangelical mind, like all human minds, is capable of remarkable self-deception when the stakes feel high enough. It showed us how people who claim divine guidance can make profoundly ungodly choices and maintain their spiritual self-image through sophisticated rationalization. But it also revealed something else. The human hunger for authentic moral leadership is so strong that people will abandon institutions that betray their trust, even when those institutions have been central to their identity and community. The young evangelicals walking away from compromised leadership aren't rejecting moral authority. They're demanding real moral authority. They're insisting that claims to biblical truth must be backed up by consistent ethical behavior. They're refusing to accept the false choice between spiritual community and moral standards. This might be the most hopeful outcome of this entire crisis. A generation that has learned to distinguish between the performance of religious authority and its authentic practice, between the rhetoric of moral leadership and its genuine demonstration. The Epstein crisis exposed the evangelical mind's vulnerabilities, but it also revealed its greatest strength: the presence within the community of people who refuse to allow those vulnerabilities to become permanent compromises. Whether that strength will be enough to restore credibility to evangelical moral leadership remains to be seen. But the conversation has begun, and that's where all moral progress starts, with the courage to acknowledge uncomfortable truths and the commitment to do better. Thanks for taking this journey with us today. If this exploration raised questions or insights for you, I'd love to hear about them in the comments. And remember to subscribe to Professor Archive for more deep dives into the stories that reveal who we really are as human beings. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep demanding better from our leaders and ourselves.